Welcome back to the CHM SpaceToday NightLife program. I'm your host, Elizabeth Lopatto. Thank you for joining us in Cal Academy of Sciences in San Francisco. This is African Hall, as you probably know, and I am welcoming here Ron Goedendorp. He's the Vice President of Space Opportunities for NanoRacks. He's got more than 20 years of experience in business and corporate development for a variety of industries, including systems, aerospace, sensors, and financial analytics. I'm so glad to have you here, Ron. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much.
It sounds like you have a strong fan base out here. So, Ron, listen, you actually have an extremely sci-fi thing going on with this company, which I think is really, really cool, which is turning used rockets into space habitats. It's not all that you guys are doing, but it is the thing that I think people would most like to hear about. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about how serious this is and about the NASA contract that you folks won in order to do this work.
Absolutely, and I'll bring it to everybody's attention. They changed the name from a Greek god to Independence One, and the renaming just happened this week. So the concept of repurposing the upper stage of a Centaur has been around for 20 plus years. So we're not doing anything that is new or novel. It's been sitting on the shelf for a while, but with the International Space Station facing decommissioning sometime in the 2020s, which is only a handful of years in space-time, what we're going to see is more and more commercial development of space stations and space infrastructure by commercial companies. NanoRacks being one of them, Bigelow, and then we recently saw announcements for a space hotel. So we're not the first, we're not going to be the last. Space is ready for habitation.
So I have a ton of questions about this, and the first and most obvious one is, how do you make sure all the fuel is gone?
That's a good and serious question. Well, we'll start off with sensors that can detect the hydrocarbons in the tanks. But before it is habitable by humans, the scrubbing and the scarring as they build infrastructure inside the empty tanks is all done by robotics, which is brilliant. This will be a new test and setting up for subsequent work that these infrastructure pieces are going to be built for. All right.
So it sounds like there's going to be some construction in space, and that sounds really challenging. How are you thinking about it?
In a very programmatic way, right? Maybe that's the best way to describe it. So the International Space Station didn't appear all at once. It was built in pieces as the planners built it, needed power, needed plumbing, all the things that you would imagine for a large cruise ship, hotel, or anything else here on Earth needed to take place in space, right? And so the space shuttle and these rockets would bring up pieces, and then they would do the in-space assembly, most of it by astronauts.
So obviously you start developing this kind of tech on Earth, right, before you begin working on it in space. What is that like?
They don't let me touch anything. I mean, maybe that's the most important piece. I'm not an engineer. Don't get near that. Besides the planning and the thought process, I think the very important thing is to understand that we're a commercial company. Although we're being partially funded by government contracts and in the interest of working with NASA as a customer, right, a regulator and an enabler, we're also looking outward towards other commercial companies that have interests in working in a space microgravity environment. So we're not doing this as a kind of clean slate. We're looking for ways that help build the infrastructure for our customers to use. So they become part of the plan. In software, we just call it customer development, right? it's not any different for hardware in space. We're looking for customers, so if there's anybody out there with $500 million who wants to build an in-space manufacturing facility, we're very open to the idea. But it's not a joke. Somebody's going to step up to the plate and start funding something like this, and it becomes part of the build process, right? And so when we start adding fixtures, hardware, plumbing, communications, we're thinking about what our customers, and again, they could be governments, they could be commercial companies, or private entities, and even individuals, what is it that they need?
Now, you mentioned something that I think a lot of folks maybe have heard about, but the end of the ISS is going to be upon us sooner rather than later. How does that change things for you, and how does that alter your plans?
It's part of our plan. Best way to think of it is that the space station gets decommissioned, but they don't turn off everything and let it come crashing to Earth. That would be bad. But rather, we look at it as an opportunity to repurpose some elements of the space station. My guess is they'll auction it off in some way, like going to a government surplus auction and buying a Jeep or something like that.
So if you guys have a couple $1 million, we could just buy the space station ourselves, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. At the cost that it costs the taxpayers and other governments, they need to find a way to recapture that value. And I think that, yeah, if it becomes too expensive to keep up in space, let's take parts of it and use the ones that are viable, the ones that aren't damaged, deteriorated, corroded, full of human detritus for the last 20 years, right? And let's put it back to use. Don't picture that.
We'll try not to picture the human detritus too much. But you're very familiar with the ISS, obviously, because you folks offer labs there. Maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about who uses those labs and what they're like.
Absolutely. We call them Nano Labs, but essentially they're boxes filled with electronics and communications. They show up as essentially a black box or with the intention of how are you going to run an experiment. Various experiments that we've seen and enabled are around specifically microgravity research, molecular structures, materials, biomaterials, pharmaceutics, and we're starting to see the benefit of doing microgravity research that furthers life here on Earth, right? Pharmaceuticals that have proven to have efficacy on Earth, but manufactured in space. We're seeing materials, Z-band or long pole optical fiber, right? Without aberration, these strands can be pulled for miles as opposed to 100 meters. That deterioration in that uniform cellular structure allows for the manufacture of materials that we hadn't known merely 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and just started to put into place 5 years ago.
So what you're saying is that we're going to have space drugs and space cables and all sorts of other good things coming our way sometime soon.
I think there are plenty of space drugs in California now.
We pioneered the space drugs, actually.
But this brings up a good point, right? So building the infrastructure for space habitation, right? Humans want to go to space. They want to explore the moon, right? Elon Musk has his sights on Mars. The problem is you can't bring a pharmacy with you to handle all the diseases, injuries, right? So without that, we're going to see things like process chemistry take place in a microgravity environment that can essentially 3D print or build these drugs. That's going to be a breakthrough in space, but it's also going to have some purpose here on Earth as, right, in remote regions where you can't, again, have a full pharmacy. Let's have this sort of thing. Very much to the point, right? A lot of people, who wants to go to space, Mars, the moon? So
all right.
Yeah, okay.
Got a brave audience here.
Yeah, awesome. I can't sell you a ticket, but we have tickets for something like 100 kilometers, but not quite fully to space. Second part of your question.
Oh dear.
The pharmaceuticals was one.
Yeah. I mean, materials. You had mentioned these kinds of materials that without gravity, it allows you to pull things farther apart. So what does that mean, not just for potentially space colonization, but again, for those of us here on Earth?
Yeah. The long-pole carbon fiber, probably, or optical fiber, has applications for communications, right? And as we're surrounded by communications and communicative devices more and more, the need for higher speed, higher throughput becomes unquestionably more valuable, right? And so deterioration, packet loss has an economic cost. So the economic value is offset by a long pole fiber, means that you can take care of a trade-off and possibly justify the cost of something that goes up $20,000 a kilogram and then comes back down. Somebody's done the ROI and says, this is doable and it makes sense, let's do it.
And there's going to be a profit margin, naturally.
Yes.
So who are the people who contract with you? It seems like you have sort of three big sectors. They are, research, education, national security. And while I would love for you to talk about national security, I suspect you're not going to be able to. So maybe you can give us a sense of who some of your clients are, what kinds of people they are, what their interests are.
I can actually talk a little bit about the national security
Say more.
because it turns out that even our US government is interested in lowering the cost of access to space. It affects you in a different way as taxpayer dollars that are used more efficiently when somebody can create a, pardon the expression, flying space burrito, right, at a fraction of the cost of a half a school bus and still get the same resolution, low cost. The government's going to shift its eye from the large commercial defense contractors, Boeing, Lockheed, Grumman, and they're going to shift over to who can provide that information or data at a lower cost. And it turns out that there are a nice handful of companies here in Silicon Valley, a shout out to Spire, Planet, a couple that will remain unnamed. That's where my little government sector just, I draw the line.
I knew there would be secrets.
But here's the small little trade-off. You may have access, or we, or you, would have access to the same type of data the government uses. The government just uses it in a much different way. But if you and I use it, or a not-for-profit uses it, they may be able to predict refugee flows, identify ships that are involved in human trafficking, illegal fishing, even deforestation. So we have access to that data, and it's available at a lower cost. So to answer the question, who are our customers? Yes, government is certainly there. NASA is also a customer. We also have customers in the private sector, and we're finding customers who never knew before that they would work with space-derived data or space-derived products. For some of us, it's transparent, but we've been benefiting from space-derived data for ages. Who used a navigation device on their phone to get here today, or even to find this room?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough when we talk about space programs is how the technology that's used in space transfers back here. So you get new styles of welding that are necessary to get things through the atmosphere, for instance. And again, when it comes to this kind of research, especially when we're talking about pharmaceuticals, are there potential benefits to doing that kind of research in zero-G? What does that offer us?
From the commercial perspective, is there something that we can do at a low enough cost to justify the research in space? What we're finding is that it is hard. There are large pharmaceutical companies, or even small ones, that start with something innovative, like the idea of doing microgravity research to uncover or rediscover a molecule. The challenge is that the intellectual property libraries that companies, Pfizer, Baxter, whoever they might be, they sit on these very hard. They won't share them with other researchers, and unless they see the profit, they won't open up the libraries of previously discovered molecules that might have efficacy, and it's hard to bring them to market. But we're starting to see the cracks open among the large pharmaceutical companies retesting and re-examining some of the molecules that have failed before, and that they're finding change enough in microgravity, the crystalline structure. They now have a benefit for people here on Earth.
Now, NanoRacks started as an idea in 2006, so the company is a bit over a decade old, at least. Maybe that's not fair. The idea is a little over a decade old. The company was founded a little bit after someone had the idea. But one of the things that's been interesting about sort of the new space generation of companies is they do things differently than some of the older companies that are out there and still quite successful. What would you say are the differences between the new space and the old space companies, if we can call them that?
I think Elon nailed it when he talked about cost, right? Just the ability to reuse a rocket is not just very cool to watch a rocket land on a pad or a barge in the ocean. He's lowering the cost of access to space, right? When it costs $20,000 a kilogram or $60,000 a kilogram, people really rethink that equation of commercial value. But when it starts to drop below that, because you have this cadence and availability and access, it's just like, well, if there's only one plane flying to Hawaii and we're all on it, somebody could demand a higher price. But if there are 1,000 planes flying, right, then the economic cost lowers, and now everybody realizes they can fly in economy class with their knees under their chin. But it all comes down to, yeah, what's the cost of sending payloads, and to the point, large structures like the upper stage of a Centaur to space, right? Reusing it is just capturing a value that might otherwise be lost as it hits the atmosphere and burns up.
So essentially what you're trying to do is take space from being something that's super expensive and basically a government endeavor to being something that is still super expensive but less expensive. And maybe not necessarily a government endeavor. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, and make it less hard. I think the realization that a number of companies, especially here in the Bay Area, started from the concept that you can send a cell phone to space, that has enough communications and processing power to go up to space. Somebody said, okay, that's great, send it up in a CubeSat, which is a little 10 by 10 by 10 centimeter form factor, and spit it out into space, and that would collect data. And they did it all for under $100,000 as a research project. That made people realize that, yeah, even wealthy individuals can participate in space discovery and space access. So it's not just cost, but it is also the perception of what we're capable of doing. Right? What you're capable of doing. It now opens up this whole Pandora's box, bad description, but this whole set of ideas around sensors, around experiments. Students, I love this part, right? Students are participating in more and more space-related projects, from simple plant experiments to these things called mix sticks, which look like a glow stick in a rave club, and you break it in space and a chemical reaction takes place, and all for the cost of a couple dozen bake sales, right? That just tells me that we're on the verge of bringing STEM to the forefront, but wow, everybody can be a cosmonaut one day, if they could shrink themselves down to a glow stick.
Right. I mean, you've had a very varied career. Did you ever imagine that you would wind up essentially working in an aerospace capacity, did you think that space was going to be your business?
That was the most remote thing 5 years ago. Absolutely. Everybody who knows me knows what I did in previous lives and previous jobs. And to get this opportunity, I just looked at it as great. I don't know anything. I don't know anyone. I don't know what I'm doing. And it was like, check, check, check. Sounds perfect. You're the right guy for the job. Really? Me of all people. But for me, it was an intellectual challenge, right? It came down to what can I learn, what do I need to know, who's doing what, and after just a brief survey, just understanding the tremendous opportunity and what I'm helping other people do, right? I'm helping others access space. My job's simple. I just listen to the great ideas, right? You can come to me with a great idea. You can come to me with a great idea. Let's talk about it, and let's figure out how to make it viable, right? How to find the funding. Is it doable? Will NASA say yes? Will NASA say yes? Please say yes, NASA.
I mean, so what you're saying is that it's not too late for anybody in this room to become involved in the aerospace industry if they want to.
Geez, look at my gray hairs, all of you dark-haired people and people with hair. It's all possible.
No, that's wonderful. It's one of those things where often you hear people who, they've spent their whole lives working as engineers. They saw Star Trek at age 5, and they were like, I'm going to do that. And then you find out that there are people who are like, oh, yes, I was a fashion designer, and then somebody asked me to start making spacesuits, so I said, sure.
I was not a fashion designer.
No, but I mean, it seems like this is something that is a relatively tight-knit industry, but that does seem relatively welcoming to people who are outside. Is that a fair way of putting it?
I was hired because I didn't know anybody in this industry.
Ooh.
So I'm going to point to that being a little bit of a success factor. Now that I'm more well-known, I start to see little barriers pop up here and there. And somebody recognized early on that, a lot of people have put a lot of time into their projects, whether they work at a place like NASA or whether they've been working in a commercial industry. Looking for funding has always been hard. I'm not saying that those people shouldn't succeed, but you build up a legacy system or a silo, and you only see what you want to see. And I show up just kind of trying to break down barriers and punch through walls, and without that same mindset, I'm not saying that I'm better at it, I just came with a fresh eye.
So in some ways, it's sort of like this is going to be very heavy-handed, and I apologize in advance, but it's like you sort of were the new space yourself a little bit, in the same way that, the new eye that came through with SpaceX and Blue Origin, the idea that reusability might be possible, something that had been totally dismissed. It seems like having a fresh perspective is a good way to go.
I won't deny that. Some of you know me, that I'm constantly curious, and I really like learning new and bright things. I'm surrounded by far more people who are far brighter than I am in this industry. They are far more accomplished. The only thing that I maybe bring is a little bit of a fresh perspective and the ability to hack through some of the systems, right? Working again with NASA or ESA, the European Space Agency, or the Japanese Space Agency. These are legacy systems, and you have to figure out how to work with them. But there are hacks, there are shortcuts, right? And coming with a hacker's perspective, yes, I came with a fresh eye.
So here's a thing that now that we've talked about your perspective, that I would love to get your perspective on, right? Obviously, there's been a push towards space tourism, especially in low Earth orbit. Is this something that interests you, or that seems like it might have a future?
Absolutely. Right now, the cost is a few $100,000 to go for a long weekend up to space. Nobody's doing it yet because we haven't built the facilities, or we don't quite have the systems, the infrastructure in place. but it'll only be a few years before all of us can buy something off of Ticketmaster, boo, and
Please
and
not
go to space,
Ticketmaster.
right? Or whoever, right? Yeah, come to the NanoRacks website. There'll be a buy your ticket here, right? And just pick your seat, one of four. But Blue Origin is kind of at the forefront of looking at short-term space, short-duration space access for commoners like myself.
I mean, this seems like one of those places where there's a large enthusiast audience, and it's just a matter of making sure that it's safe enough that people are willing to do it. And one of the things that people have talked about is like, well, you know, there are all these people who go to Everest. They know that there's a chance they'll die. People do die every year. Is this essentially something like Everest, or do you see this as being categorically different?
Well, I think let's ask the audience real quick. Of those who want to go to space, who will go to space within the next, who thinks they'll go to space within the next few years regardless of the risk?
Wow.
Okay,
no
we've got
one.
one. We've got one or two.
All right.
Good. So they understand the risk, right? Who's more likely to go to Everest?
Fair enough.
I think that the perspective is simply knowing what the risks are, right? So what is it? 1 in 10 launch vehicles has an anomaly, right?
Now, to be fair, the anomalies are not necessarily the rocket blows up.
Right, but they might apply a little higher standard of safety for those human-carrying vehicles. They certainly do today. We rely on the Russians for building a durable, successful launches to bring astronauts up to the space station. So maybe the Russians are the first ones who come up with the frequent flyer program.
I mean, maybe.
Go
but
Yuri.
It seems like there are a lot of people who are really actively pursuing this, and you know, there is of course the commercial crew program that has SpaceX probably is going to be going up with people either late this year or most likely next year, knowing how Elon Musk does with deadlines. That's an inside joke for those of you who follow Elon. But it does seem like this is something that America is trying to get back into. Do you think that it is possible to compete with the Russian sort of monopoly right now on taking people to space?
Absolutely. I think that between working with the regulatory agencies that need to make sure that the humans are flying up in a safe environment and in a rocket that won't have an anomaly, they're going to need to participate, but I think that America stands a chance between the multi-billionaires Bezos and Musk, right? And Branson. Let's not forget Branson's still out there trying. And so if it's a race to bring humans comfortably and safely, what better place than California?
I'm so glad you brought up the billionaires, because it seems like they've been having this sort of disproportionate influence, at least in America, on space. And it seems like it's been a billionaire's hobby for a minute. Those of you who may remember, Bill Gates had a hot moment in the 90s where he thought he was going to put up a satellite array, and it didn't work out because the tech wasn't there, so he stopped. But the tech is there now. So what influence do these sort of wealthy individuals have on the space industry?
Financing. I don't think it's any more than that. And I guess there's a little bit of ego at play here, right? Who's going to do these things first? Who's going to be first to Mars, first to Moon?
I mean, there is the slap fight that's been going on between SpaceX and Blue Origin about who really landed their booster first. So I would say ego definitely plays a role.
I agree. And I'm not going to take sides on either one. All these people are my friends.
Small industry. So when you're thinking about what the future looks like, and I don't mean the far future, not 20 years from now, 30 years from now, but the next 5 to 10 years for space, for experiments in space, for people in space, what do you see?
I think we brought it up earlier. It'll be the opportunity for people like those in the room to access space maybe participate in experiments, go to a hotel. We'll start to see a space economy start to evolve, and maybe there's a home for a Bitcoin miner somewhere on the moon. The economies are going to be a little bit different. Space law is certainly something in areas that are evolving, and we're going to have to face a lot of the challenges that building a new nation has. It's pioneering, it's a frontier, overused terms, but humans are driven to inhabit the places where they're not allowed to go. So why not space?
I'm really glad you brought up space law because it is complicated, thorny, and sort of difficult. How do you manage to navigate the regulatory environment and work with NASA for some of the projects that NanoRacks does?
Interesting you should ask that. First, when we say where is NanoRacks headquartered, the answer is Houston. But we have a large contingent in Washington, D.C. in order to work with the people who develop space policy. Having access to the heads of NASA as well as the current administration helps pave the way through the prickly part of doing business in space. There's a lot of resistance to commercializing space. I understand that, and I understand the concerns. But at the same time, these billionaires are the ones who are financing it. It's crazy to continually have governments take the people's money and advance novel or unique scientific projects that may not have significant human benefit. If guys like Bezos, Musk, Branson, and Paul Allen and others do have the money and they're just going to sit on it, why not put it to work in space and develop things that have commercial viability, and then the governments can step back and support adequately the research that discovers new drugs or a test of a new facility, some things that are just a little more peripheral. Let the core be financed by those who have.
So I guess the next question that I have is, what kinds of policy changes would you like in an ideal world? Like if you could, tomorrow, you could go up to Washington and you could say, this is what I want, and everyone said done. What would those changes be?
This is a trap, isn't it? Okay, who here works at NASA? Who here works at NASA? Come on, be honest. Okay. We like NASA. NASA's a great regulator. NASA's a great partner. NASA's a great landlord. But NASA is also a separate series of bureaucracies and fiefdoms, many of which we have to run from center to center to center. Somebody says yes here, somebody says no here, and it's very inconsistent. Well, my request would be consistent policy across the regulatory landscape.
Well, I mean, this sounds a lot like going from NASA press office to NASA press office. So I think we can agree on that. That it would be nice to see a little bit more of a centralized policy.
If my phone starts buzzing, I lost my job.
Well, hopefully we won't do that. But I guess one of the things that is exciting about working with NASA, and you mentioned that they are your landlord, which is true. NanoRacks has space on the ISS. Is that NASA was of course the agency here that really sort of broke the ground for everything else that is currently happening. What kinds of groundbreaking work do you think NASA could be doing in the next 20, 30 years that could potentially lead private companies to follow?
Absolutely, they're doing them now, right? So there are a number of animal studies. Most of us have heard the story of the Kelly twins, one of them going to space and the change in Scott Kelly's genome. Okay, what does it mean? We don't quite know what it means, but we're not going to keep sending twins up. Wrigley should support this. But they're doing research on animals in order to understand the changes, because as we spend more and more time traveling between planets, right? Maybe somebody doesn't want to stay in a space hotel for a year, but we just need to make that travel. We need to understand what the implications are for that travel. And NASA is putting a lot of time, money, and energy into, human and health services in space. More of that can happen if commercial picks up a little bit more of the, this is regular stuff we do, right? Weather, data.
Well, I think I've exhausted my questions, but that doesn't mean that you guys can't ask some. We're going to be coming around with a microphone for those of you who have questions. If you have a question, would you mind raising your hand? Got a question?
Uh-oh.
This guy looks mischievous. I like it.
Ron, you talk about private astronauts and stuff like that. NanoRacks, you guys are on the ISS. When is NanoRacks going to have their own astronaut on the ISS?
That's a good question. Hopefully it precedes a business development guy. The answer is that that's a hurdle that the space agencies put up, right? Because the qualifications for becoming an astronaut are fairly rigorous. If you left it up to the devices of the commercial sector, it's like, let's just find a low-paid employee who can, put two bolts together. Right, so it'll need to be somebody who is highly specialized, and the short answer is probably not before 2024.
Here in the back, so I have a question for Ron. He brings up a great point about financing. So why did things move to privatization? Like, why did NASA come in the background and we have all these billionaires like Elon Musk and Virgin Galactic taking the forefront? Like, where do we go sideways? Where do we deprioritize exploring space as a country and moving towards privatization versus government funded?
I think you're already seeing that taking place. NanoRacks has more competitors now, right, than we did a mere 9 years ago. 9 years ago, we were a little bit on the cutting edge, but now it's become commonplace for other people to take on kind of a brokering role and an intermediary and working through the integration. Sadly, NASA has layoffs every once in a while, and the commercial sector picks up those people and puts them to work in the private sector. So I think we are seeing the shift take place, but most of that's going to be driven by the availability of funding for commercial efforts, right? And so let the billionaires kind of blaze the trail, and then we'll start picking up the interesting and commercially viable pieces.
So I love hearing about space hotels in 10 to 15 years, but I worry that it's just sort of futurism. And I'm wondering what sort of, mile markers are you looking for in the next 2-3 years that are a good indication that we're actually going to get to the place that we're talking about?
Great question. So it might be interesting just to talk about our near-term future, right, as a company. The International Space Station is the primary platform, and it's going to be around for another handful of years. So we can use parts of that now to test out the facilities and manufacture components that would work with that facility and independently. So we're building an airlock, and the Japanese have an airlock on the space station. It's a meter in diameter, so that limits the throughput, but we're starting to build and should have at the end of 2019, early 2020, in place a larger airlock that's about 2 meters in diameter. Allows for more throughput, larger satellites, experiments exposed to space manufacturing in a vacuum environment. So that would be a step that bolts onto the commercial space station that we were talking about, the Independence, right? And that'll be part of that system where now an astronaut coming from the space station can go into the commercial facility, right? Move material, fix a part, replace something, take some goods out, bring it to the space station, and then it gets downmasked. So it's part of the infrastructure, step by step, of building, and soon there will be, right? Next there will need to be inter-orbital and interstation transportation, right? Something bringing things back and forth. But for now, that airlock allows the commercial module to bolt up to the space station and then leave and do its work, come back. So it'll be successive and very real steps. I love reading The Martian and listening to Artemis because all of these things now sound so close.
Hi, my question is, of all the different payloads that have been sent up by NanoRacks, what has been the most intriguing or most interesting to you when it comes to like the experiments that have been done in the microgravity environment up on the ISS?
Wow, I don't have a favorite.
That's not true. This guy's a parent, I'm sure of it. I don't have a favorite kid.
Okay, so nothing related to NanoRacks so there's this horrible disease called Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and it affects a certain number of people, a very small patient population, but people who have it don't live beyond their 20s, right? And so some Japanese researchers years ago started a program and brought the research to space to find that the molecule to treat this works when it is developed, manufactured in a microgravity environment, extending the doubling the lives of these patients. So, yeah, if there's one that really caught my attention and kind of gives me the motivation to keep doing what I'm doing, I'd say it was that one.
So if a while ago it was hundreds of millions of dollars to put things in space, and today it's hundreds of thousands of dollars to put things in space, albeit a little bit smaller. In the next 5 to 10 years, what does that look like? What's the Moore's law of satellites? And is that even the question, or is it more the regulatory restrictions that will kick in at some point in time?
I think it's going to be two factors here. Number one is the miniaturization and just the higher capability of experiments that are being put into space. We're figuring out how to package things smaller. We're doing a lot of the processing in space. Everything is shrinking. Again, from the half a school bus to the size of a loaf of bread for satellites. That miniaturization and the lowering of costs has made everything happen. To the point, the cost of space access will continue to drop. Will it be that precipitous? I can't predict that, but I'd say let's just keep going and trying. And somebody has to figure out just how to defy the laws of gravity. Who will it be?
So actually, to follow up to that question, what is the most commercially viable products that you see now going into space? And if it does go down over time, who's on that border? Like, what do you see next is happening? Like, oh, this is the next big thing that's just out of the financially viable area now.
It's probably the most boring of all possible things, and that is data. Yeah. The availability and the cost of space-derived data has dropped so fast that although it's going to affect every single human life on this planet for the foreseeable future, most of us don't know what to do with it. And as we're finding new ways to use data and data-derived products from space, and that cost just keeps going down further and further, it's going to mesh with kind of the that thing that made Silicon Valley awesome, right? Open source.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question.
I had a question about greenhouse gases and emissions when going up into space. Are you working to reduce emissions for launching in terms of the environmental impact?
We are not working on that directly, but that's a real issue, right? The hydrocarbons produced by 3 large rocket engines firing off is pretty significant. I heard somebody use the measurement, and I might be wrong, so don't quote me, but SpaceX launch is the equivalent of 2747 circling the Earth.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been great having you here, Ron. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. And
Thank you, Liz.
that concludes the program.